Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of the World Discord Podcast. I'm Brian Endless.
I'm Joel Ostrow. Hi, Brian. How you doing today?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Joel?
I'm okay. It's Friday morning.
It is. It's a little chilly here today, but not too
Yeah.
bad. So today we're doing one that is long overdue. We're going to talk about Syria and what is happening in Syria. I just want to give a little bit of background to kind of get us up to date, and then we'll move into our guest, who is much more expert than both of us on this topic. Syria has a long history, but I think we can really skip forward to 1970. That's when Hafez al-Assad took over the country in a bloodless coup, and he became a dictator for 30 years until he died in 2000. And his son, Bashar al Assad, took over, and he ruled until last year, so another 23-year rule. Syria was one of many countries that was hit by the Arab Spring in 2011, but it was not a quick Arab Spring for Syria. That led to a civil war that effectively lasted until last year. It had a number of ups and downs over time. In 2013 and 2015, it looked like the Assad regime might collapse. And then after that, they made a comeback. And for the last 3 years, it looked like things, 2, 3 years, it looked like things had really settled out and Assad was back in power. And then all of a sudden last year, the civil war picked up again. And the next thing we knew, Assad was running to Russia, and we had a new regime in power, and we know very little about them. So we will turn to our guest for that and to fill in a lot of the background that I missed there. Joel, why don't you give an introduction?
Thanks, Brian. We are fortunate to be joined today by Professor Joshua Landis, co-chair of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. I think I got that right. Do I have that right?
You do indeed.
Great. As Brian said, Brian and I both, sort of follow Syria a little bit. I've happened to have a lot of students over the years who have families have fled the country at one time or another over the past 50 years. But Joshua, if you might sort of bring us in, what was the trigger for the unrest in Syria at the beginning of the last decade? I mean, I know the events of the Arab Spring were happening, but if you could tell us, like, what destabilized politics in Syria then at that time, and if you can give us a little rundown of the sequence of events from that point on, with maybe a little description of the various major players involved, internally and externally, I guess. Give us a little overview.
Sure. Let me begin with a sort of the long view before I get to the short view.
Great.
In many ways, what we're seeing today is the end of a post-colonial era. Now, that sounds complicated. It's not. After World War I, the European powers divided up the Middle East amongst themselves, France and Great Britain, and carved up the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the Middle East for 500 years. And Lebanon and Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan were all created, and the lines were drawn rather haphazardly. In order to, and then they took them as mandates. The League of Nations awarded all of these different states as basically colonies to both France and Britain,
Right.
until the two powers left at the end of World War II. And France pulled out of Syria and Lebanon in 1946. But the entire region under the colonial rule was led by a divide and conquer strategy, so that in every one of these states, these new states, minorities were given the lion's share of power in order that they would be dependent on the colonial power and help them, as a collaborative elite, help them rule the region.
That's standard in a lot of colonial
standard
territories.
approach, yeah.
It's a standard colonial approach, but it had a big imprint on the region, because once the colonial powers left, the minorities who had been given the lion's share of power were able to grab control of the state. And, in Lebanon, the minority of interest was the Maronite Christians, And Lebanon had a long civil war, 1975 to 90, in which the Christians were shoved aside and Muslims took the majority of the power. In Iraq, the Sunni Muslims were 20% of the country, but they were put into power by the British, the Hashemite kingdom. And then the Ba'ath Party recapitulated this, and Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Arab, and the Ba'ath Party and his army were all Sunni dominated. When America swanned into Iraq in 2003, they took the Sunnis from the top of society and cast them to the bottom, catapulting the Shiites, who were 60% the majority, to the top. And of course, that launched a terrible civil war because the balance of power was disturbed, and the Sunnis joined Al Qaeda and other groups in order to fight the Americans, try to regain their power. In Israel Palestine, you can even fit into the same paradigm because the Jews were less than 10% of the population of Palestine before the First World War. By 1948, when the British withdrew, they were a third of the population, roughly. But because of their prowess on the battlefield and their support from international powers, they were able to defeat the Palestinians, drive 800,000 of them out of the country, and turn themselves from a minority into the majority of the population, and occupy the other territories. The Palestinians have been, of course, fighting to regain their previous position, but have lost ground steadily since.
And
Syria,
for those who don't have a map of the Middle East in their heads, I love what you're doing because you're describing everything around Syria right now, all the
right,
background
but
around
now
Syria.
we're going to get to Syria, which
Yep.
is the key here. And our minority of interest in Syria is the Alawites. And the Alawites are about 12% of the population, but they formed a coalition with Christians, Druze, Ismailis, who are also minority religions and minority communities, and they supported Bashar al-Assad, who was an Alawite, and Hafez al-Assad previous to him, more or less, because they were worried about the majority Sunni Arabs coming to power and discriminating against them and casting them to the margins. So this tension between religious communities and ethnic communities, because the Kurds more or less sided with the minorities because they were worried about discrimination as well. And they're a big factor in Syria today, so I'm bringing in the Kurds. But the minorities in Syria, only religious and ethnic, only constitute about 30% of the country today. So they're against, but they were given the lion's share of power because the Alawites joined the army that the French created during the first part of the 20th century in big numbers. And we know this because the first indications in 1955 is that about over 50% of the non-commissioned officers in the Syrian army were Alawites at the time. And Syria, when the French left, you had a Sunni Arab parliament. The merchant class, the landed class was Sunni Arab because the Ottoman Empire had been Sunni Arab. They're the educated elite. They dominated parliament, and the French left a parliament and a president in place. But the army was full of minorities. And very quickly, the army took over and threw out the Sunni Arab politicians from power. There was a whole series of coups because it wasn't clear who dominated the army. Tons of purges. The Alawite non-commissioned officers go up the pipeline and they become dominant. And in 1966, the first Alawite takes power. But in 1970, Hafez al-Assad grabs power from Jadid, who preceded him, and he consolidates. And the way he consolidates and stabilizes Syria is that he puts family members, he uses traditional loyalties, even though the Ba'ath Party ideologically is we're going to wipe out all tribalism and confessionalism, make a secular Syria where everybody's equal. And it really became taboo to even mention your religion. But underneath that facade of secular equality was a strong sense of your communal background. And Assad used that to stabilize his own rule by putting his family members at the most crucial positions, such as such as his brother in charge of the palace guard. Then he put Alawites, co-religionists, in the
Right.
top security positions. By the end of the Civil War, all 40 top generals in the military were all Alawite.
And
As
just to be clear for a second, Joshua, we're going back and forth between religion and community here. My understanding in Syria is that it is a more political Islam, in that the Assad and the other Alawites in power weren't really there for religious reasons. It was more that the religion created a community connection. Is that correct, or was it
No,
a
it's a
religious
chicken and egg
background?
thing. It's a chicken
Okay,
and egg thing. The Alawites are have clung to secularism because as a national ideology, because of course, if there's a religion, if a religion is the binding loyalty, then the minorities are going to be discriminated
right,
against. So they went for Arab nationalism and an
right.
ethnic identity because they're all Arabs.
That
Now
makes
that
sense.
excluded the Kurds. And
Hmm.
the Kurds today are demanding, if they're going to come back
Yeah.
under the control of the government, they're asking that it not be the Syrian Arab Republic. They want
Right.
it to be the Syrian Republic. So that
Yeah,
Kurds, so that it doesn't discriminate between Arabs and so forth. The Arabs say, no way, it's an Arab republic, and the Kurds don't want to come under that kind of
right.
discriminatory control. At any rate, the point is, when I say community, these religious communities have taken on an ethnic tint.
Got
In
it.
some ways, religion is the new ethnicity in the Middle East. In Central
Yeah.
Europe, all of the ethnic cleansing and battles was about ethnicity.
Hmm.
Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, so forth. They ethnically cleansed each other and chopped each other up according to their ethnic background. But in the Middle East, religion is taking on an ethnic tint, just the way for Jews has
Hmm.
become an ethnicity, not just a religion.
Right.
And it's doing the same thing with Shiites and Sunnis, with Yazidis. Those communities, because they're fearful, uh,
Hmm.
have taken on various ethnic
Yeah.
qualities. It's hard to really distinguish them.
Yeah,
It's
makes a
that
lot of
great
sense.
Lake and Rothschild article from back in the Bosnia War. Um, I forget what it was called, not the politics of fear, but yeah, fear, community based on fear,
Right.
um,
Right. Which is one
ethnic,
of the big
ethnic community based on fear. Yeah. So, what triggered the events around 2011 in Syria? Because I read a lot. I think it depends what you read, right? Like if I'm reading about climate change, I read climate was the cause of the
everything.
unrest in
Yes.
Syria, but then everyone, whichever lens, there's any number of lenses you can put as a cause. How do you read, like, what triggered the civil war and ultimate collapse of the Assad regime?
Well, it's a whole number of factors.
Hmm.
Primary is that you have this minoritarian regime, and
Oh,
everywhere around it, that post-colonial setup had collapsed.
okay.
Lebanon, a civil war. Iraq, Americans had kicked out the Sunnis. Israel, Jews had come to dominate and push the
Mm.
Palestinians to the margins. So Syria was the last order in which this minoritarian regime was ruling, and it became ever more brutal in order to hold on to power. And it coup-proofed itself by using these traditional loyalties. And it's supposed to be a republic where everybody's
Yeah.
supposed to be equal and so forth. And so the the hypocrisy of the entire political setup and the ideology of Baathism and nationalism was just screaming out for repair. And and you got the rise of Islamic groups and the Muslim Brotherhood from one end of the Middle East to the other. Iraq, with America's experimentation, of course, moved to this majority Shiite rule, but it took on a very powerful sectarian quality, with Shiites killing Sunnis and back and
Yeah.
forth, and the Kurds getting a little bit of independence. So all of that had a very profound effect in Syria and began to pull the country apart. In 2011, you get the Arab Spring, which was freedom. Now, Americans always say it's about democracy, but
Mhm.
it's for democracy for a small, educated elite who
Right.
have a clear idea about what democracy is. But for most Syrians, it's just freedom. let's get out from underneath this crappy regime that's corrupt and so forth. And I, I want, I want to be represented in some way. And that, there were tons of Islamists who, of course, want to have Islamic rule with Sharia law, which is not
Yeah.
democracy either. But it's freedom for them. They get to express their identity, and they're at the center of power, and that's good. So it's about dignity. It's about being repressed. It's about wanting to get rid of a crappy regime that's been discriminating against you. So
And I think you're making a great distinction there because,
Yeah.
from an American perspective, we tend to think the only kind of freedom is democracy. But this is a region that's never had widespread democracy, and they look at freedom differently than we do. They want different things, they have different life goals. So that
right.
makes a lot of sense.
Really interesting.
And this was American misinterpretation of the Arab Spring, and it's one of the
Mhm.
reasons why you don't have any democracies as a result of the Arab Spring is because it wasn't the major drive. Um, it- the drive was well, the things we've talked about is
Yeah.
is getting rid of corrupt regimes. Um, Now, there's always a liberal elite that's very Western education that does want democracy and understands what democracy is. But anyway, we won't get into the larger
Yeah.
democracy debate. The
Yeah.
point is, is that Syria, the regime is crumbling. And now America had put devastating sanctions on Syria. So one of the major reasons it fell is because the government couldn't pay the soldiers anymore. It was bankrupt. And an officer at the front lines was getting paid $30 a month. The enlisted men, $10 a month. So what
Wow.
most of the officers did around Aleppo, the first city to fall, was they sent their troops home, at least 50% of them, so that they could collect the $10 a month,
Uh-huh.
Interesting.
not distribute it to the men, and they would keep it for themselves
Mm.
because they needed to feed their families.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they had alienated the public because at the roadblocks they would be demanding
Yeah. Yeah.
a little bit of money here, taking something out of the car, look for the food bag, and that somebody had gone shopping, and so it was just petty nastiness that the people were upset, the soldiers were upset, and nobody was on the front lines.
What
Now,
time
so
period are we talking about right now?
we're talking about when the regime falls, just
Okay.
2 years
So just
ago.
last year, end of
But
last year.
the sanctions, of course, had been on since
Right.
1976, but they
Right.
really get doubled down after the uprising. And
Yeah.
so the short term reasons why the regime collapses is um, very strict sanctions. Russia, the main benefactor of Syria, because it's using its air force, it's got airplanes and pilots that are helping in the air keep Assad in power. Russia is completely preoccupied in Ukraine and has withdrawn some aircraft, and it's just not in a
Yeah.
position to resupply Syria. Secondly, the major supporters of Assad are other Shiite, the Alawites are a Shiite heterodox religious group, and they're allied with the other Shiite population in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in Iran. So if we take, here's a little sideline interesting fact is that if you take Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, all together, the populations, even though Sunni Arabs are the majority in Syria and a crushing majority, if you add all those three countries together, there's more Shiite Arabs than there are Sunni Arabs. So that meant that Assad, even though he's a minoritarian regime, he could count on Hezbollah, Shiite force in Lebanon, Ahl al-Haq, and many other pro-Iranian Shiite militias in Iraq to come in and shore him up.
Right.
And Iran sending military forces as well.
Yeah.
So he had a backstop of many important Shiite militias, and they were keeping him in power even though he was bankrupt. Now,
And that was
Hezbollah,
important to Iran and to others in the overall big picture Shia Sunni conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia and others. They wanted to make sure, as much as possible, they kept their power base there.
Yeah.
absolutely. And, it's called the Shiite Crescent, that whole bunch of
Mhm.
states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran. King Abdullah II of Jordan called it the Shiite Crescent. He's trying to frighten people because he's
Yeah.
Sunni power.
Yeah.
And And in some ways, he's right. This security architecture across the Middle East, Shiite crescent, also resistance to Israel, had taken a stand that the Palestinians should be ruling Palestine,
Yeah.
not the Jews, that this was an imperialist project. And so arms could be sent from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to Hezbollah. And that was also the big deterrent factor from Israel bombing Iran's nuclear facilities, because they were always worried that if they did bomb Iran,
Hmm.
Hezbollah, which had tons of these Iranian rockets, would shower them down on Israel.
Right.
So it was a deterrent factor. But Israel, after defeating Hamas, decided we're going to take on Hezbollah. And as you know,
Yeah.
they decimated
Hmm.
Hezbollah. Major support for Assad. They also bombed Iran. And
Hmm.
America was sitting on the border between Iraq and Syria and wouldn't let any of the Iraqi militias come in and support Assad. It shot a bunch of them up as they tried to come over. So Assad was standing all alone when this rebel attack, supported by Turkey, took Aleppo, and his army melted away. And within 10 days, they'd gotten to Damascus and deposed him, and that was the end.
That's something that I had not read. So was Turkey really an active player? And maybe before getting to that, it might be useful if you could identify the major pieces on the chessboard right now in Syria. Who are the groups? You know, we read a lot in the media that these are extremists or terrorist groups. Clearly, the one currently holding power is trying to recast itself. But if you can give us a brief, just kind of rundown, really brief on the various major contestants or players inside Syria, and then maybe touch on Turkey's role in the fall
Okay.
of Assad.
Well, the number one force is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS as it's called. And it's led by a guy named Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. That's his nom de guerre. He has changed his name a month ago to his birth name, Ahmed al-Shara.
Hmm.
Now, he left Syria in 2003 as a young 20-year-old
Hmm.
to go to Iraq and become a jihadist and to fight American
Oh.
troops who he saw as colonial, imperialist power coming to kill fellow Sunnis in Iraq, which is what it was doing, um, essentially, from a Syrian point of view, from a Sunni Arab point of view. It was going to ruin the Sunni Arab community of Iraq and take this country, put it under the Shiites, which then became pro Iranian, and it really disturbed the status quo in the Middle East. So
Did he join ISIL at the time, or was it a
he
different group?
joined Al Qaeda, which
Okay,
was before ISIS
got
comes
it,
much later,
got it.
and Al Qaeda in Iraq transforms into ISIS. But he joins in 2003. It's Al Qaeda all around, and it's Zarqawi. You remember Zarqawi was this sort
Mhm.
of the dark Aminos Grease that's come from Afghanistan that builds Al Qaeda in Iraq and starts taking it to the Americans with car bombs all the time. And he's joining this group, and he gets arrested by the Americans for 5 years. He spends part of that in Camp Buka, which
Huh.
was where um, El Baghdadi, who would later become
Mhm.
Caliph Baghdadi of ISIS. First, Baghdadi was the head. After a bunch of leaders of Al Qaeda were killed, he became the head of it, and then he's going to transform it into ISIS. And his lieutenant, one of his lieutenants, is Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who he then sends when there's the Arab Spring uprising in Syria, 2011. Jolani is sent from Iraq by Caliph Baghdadi, who's not Caliph yet, but he's just Al Qaeda, you know,
Hmm.
emir. He sends him to Syria to build a branch of Al Qaeda in Syria, Jolani does magnificently. It turns out to be really the most potent militia in Syria. Now, there are, in 2013, 2 years after this uprising started, the CIA estimates that there are about 1,500 militias in Syria. That's because
Jeez.
it is. It
Yeah,
is amazing because Syria is not a very united country. So each town
Yeah.
and big
Okay.
clans, tribes are all creating their own militia.
right.
And they're trying to
Are they
grab gold.
connected together? Or are they really independent of each other?
Well, that's always been the big debate.
Okay.
Many call themselves the Free Syrian Army,
Uh-huh.
FSA. That's what became the generic name that America called them in the West. All newspapers said FSA, but none of them were following any leader.
Yeah,
Right.
So America was trying to unite them. And Secretary of State Clinton and so forth was trying to build. She built up Friends of Syria and got 100 nations
yeah,
into it, and they would meet with these leaders. But there would always be a cacophony of different, and there were all these civil society people, most of whom were like educated in the United States or Paris and had lived in the West for 20 years. And they became the leaders recognized by the UN and recognized by America and France. But the people on the ground, these militia leaders,
Yeah.
were the real players. And they're the
Okay.
ones who've come to power today. And all of those civil society people that America chose are out on their, you know, they're saying hello and they're going back to Syria, but they have no power.
right.
So
Well,
why
the
have
other
they
thing,
united behind Jelani or this Shara? Is that what his name is now? Like
Shut up.
why
Yes,
they seem to have at least coalesced around him. Why is that?
they
If
have. Well, he's become the superhero. And that's
uh,
because he was the biggest militia.
mm,
Caliph Baghdadi, I'll explain to you why he broke from ISIS, because he's gone through a number of personality changes and militia changes, which
yeah,
have evolved. And it's important that the evolution is important because America's trying to decide
who is
if
he?
he's Al Qaeda or if
Yeah,
he's a good guy.
right.
yeah,
Do we drop sanctions? Do we keep sanctions?
yeah.
Do we drop the Kurds? Do we keep the Kurds? And we're not at all agreed on that. As Americans aren't, and neither is the Trump administration. So that's the big question on the front burner. And so everybody's trying to evaluate who is this guy, and will he play ball with us? Is he dangerous? These sorts of things. So he set up the first big militia. Al Qaeda had this Islamic imprint. It was better at fighting than most other militias because it could depend on Al Qaeda trained people from Afghanistan, from Iraq, who'd been fighting for decades, who knew how to make bombs, who had a real strategic vision of the world. And they had Islamic creds. So
Yeah.
they were helping him, and he recruited Muslims from around the world. So he had Chechens and Uzbeks and French people and Tunisians and so forth, all coming in, bringing tons of expertise and knowledge of the West and of fighting. All of this helped power him to the top. And what that meant is that when America was pouring in billions of dollars, as well as Turkey and Saudi Arabia, to some of these minor militias, they would have to cough up and pay protection money to Al Qaeda
Yeah,
and give them weapons and money in order to stay alive, because Al Qaeda could just eat them alive. But in order to remain independent, they were like pilot fish. In order to remain independent, they had to give 40%
right.
to that way America could also keep the pretext of we don't support Al Qaeda. We're not on the same team, even though National Security Advisor had boasted to
Yeah.
Anthony Lake had written that important email to Clinton that's become so famous, and he said, "Hey," he said, "Hey, we're on the same team. We're on the same side as Al Qaeda this time," and everybody understood it.
Right.
But of course, America wasn't giving money to Al Qaeda, and that's a misnomer. There's tons of memes on the internet of Al Qaeda and America created Al Qaeda. It didn't create it, but it was feeding it indirectly, and Americans understood this. But they were willing to accept that crazy ambiguity because war does strange things, and you need to win. And
Well, I
everybody
think what
understood that Al Qaeda was the best winner. on the
I think
field.
what you're describing now is something that I'd heard throughout the Syrian civil war. The U.S. just couldn't settle on anybody that actually had any power to back. We never really had one side that was going to help win the war or defeat Assad
Look at
because of exactly what you're describing.
liberals in the Middle East, the Harvard educated Middle Easterners, were not getting down in the trenches with machine guns.
No. Right.
They were in the five-star hotels telling America what to do,
Right.
but
Mhm.
but they weren't going to get in the scrum. So it's the hard-bitten people like El Jolani who went off at 20 years old to fight and fought for 20 bloody years in the trenches, ends up getting shoved up into this little province near the Turkish border called Idlib in 2016-17, at the end of a long and bloody civil war, where he's really the loser in many
Right.
ways. But he maintains his militia, he grabs this province, and Turkey creates a no-fly zone for all these defeated militias that get pushed up into the north near Turkey. Turkey doesn't want them all in, and their families inside Turkey.
Right.
So it creates a no-fly zone, it builds a wall, and it keeps them entrapped in this region, but it begins to feed them with
Mm.
arms, night goggles, uniforms, you name it. It puts electricity into these areas, it builds schools, and it helps teach El Jolani, look, change the name of your militias, do it right, make friends with the Westerners. And he did. He made friends with all the NGOs and he did women's education. Yes, the women in his schools had to wear hijab and had to wear a niqab, actually. But he got the foreign NGOs in there
Huh.
to feed, to build education, help fund the place.
There was
And he
almost
changed
no
his name.
reporting on this during the time that I like. We heard very little about this, at least in mainstream media. That's really, and this is going on
Well, because
not just
everybody thought he
but
was a
through the
loser. Everybody
pandemic,
thought
right?
he was a loser, trapped in this
Yeah,
little, in a
yeah,
Gaza strip along the
yeah.
north.
Had no idea all this was going on there.
We
Huh.
didn't. And that's why we were so shocked when he busted
Oh.
out of
But
his
like we're
little.
allies of Turkey's, like we didn't know Turkey was doing this. Somebody had to.
Well, but Assad was so weak.
Huh.
Everybody thought, okay, he's busted out and he's going to take a bunch of towns and take a big highway. Nobody thought he could take Aleppo, the second largest city in Syria.
Yeah.
I don't think even
Yeah.
Turkey thought he could do it.
Right.
Okay.
But he
You're
got to
also,
he got to the gates of Aleppo and the soldiers ran away. They
wow.
got into buses and they just hightailed it because nobody wanted
They
to be
weren't getting paid, right?
they weren't getting paid. Nobody wanted to die for that regime anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
You're also
Assad,
building,
the
sorry,
central tent peg of this whole thing was in Russia at the
yeah.
time because his son was graduating from a Russian university. He was in Russia with his family, all saying congratulations to the kid. And all of a sudden, the army starts to flee.
Wow.
And anyway, the
You're also
whole
building a picture of a very practical guy where a lot
Yeah.
of Western media had him as a fundamentalist. You're describing someone who has changed to be practical a number of
he
different
is very
times.
practical. He is nothing but practical, and he has changed. As soon as he got to Damascus, he did a whole string of things that reassured the world.
Yeah.
First of all, he said, "This is the end of the revolution," which was music to the ears of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Jordan, all the surrounding countries who were worried. Oh, Al Qaeda's taken Damascus. Next, it's going to be me, right?
Right.
He's going to fire up the Islamists and pay the Muslim brothers. And this is going to be like the Iranian Revolution all over again with tons of
Right.
propaganda wanting to spread.
Right.
So he said, the revolution's over. I'm not an international jihadist. We don't support anything outside of our borders. I'm a Syrian nationalist.
Which of course he wasn't, but okay.
But he was working on. He learned to be a Syrianist.
Yeah.
Once he left Iraq and he got to Syria and he realized
Yeah.
this is what my country needs. This is what I
Yeah.
have to do to survive and to get foreign support.
Yeah. He's smart.
He's smart.
Yeah.
He's a smart guy. He put on a suit. He trimmed his beard. He's beginning to put his wife out into some public situations. The first time we saw a picture of her was when he went to Saudi Arabia and she did Umrah, and she didn't have the niqab on. She'd taken off the niqab,
Mm.
just had a headscarf, tightly done, so no hair showing her stuff.
Yeah.
And then in Turkey, she got more photographs with Erdogan's wife, and so she's coming. He's doing everything to try to show to the West, I'm not anti-woman. I'm not going to hurt women. The women are going to play their role, and he's said the right things, saying, I'm
Hmm.
going to include all elements of Syria, meaning the Alawites and the Christians and so forth.
And was it yesterday or the day before he basically told Iran to go chase a cat?
Oh yeah, he's dead set against Iran. He said,
Yeah.
we want to be friends with everybody but Iran.
But and Russia too, right? Like it sounds like that's a
Well,
little
he's
bit.
backing away from that a little bit. Yes, he wanted to. He chased Russia out,
Yes.
but my hunch is he's going to come back to Russia.
Ooh.
Why? Because he needs an army. The moment he took Damascus, Israel bombed over 200 military sites in
Right.
Syria and blew up every rocket, every tank it could find, everything to do with Assad's military. It did not want to have
Right.
ex Al Qaeda guy in Damascus with anything but a Tommy gun. And at any rate, it was just a moment for Israel. They had just
Yeah.
done Hezbollah. They wanted to get rid of anything on their borders.
Right.
So they took him down, and he's got nothing, right? He's got to get a military. Now, where do you turn to build a military?
Especially with Trump having won in November, like things could have really been different maybe if there was a Biden administration to work with, but clearly this administration's got no interest
No, we
in
just heard
trying to.
we just heard the confirmation hearing for Tulsi Gabbard, right? Who said I was a soldier in Iraq, right? These guys were killing me. Jolani was out there trying to bomb us all the time.
Yep.
This
She's not
guy's
wrong.
outside,
Yeah.
and that's why I met with Assad. Everybody was trying to say that she was a Russian agent, and she was saying, "No, I wasn't a Russian agent. I just didn't like to have Al Qaeda take over Syria because they were killing me." So, you have two different views on what's good for Syria, and the point is that will America cotton up to this guy? No. And Israel has taken the point of view that he's a danger. And now, instead of having Iran, which had been their enemy, their big number one enemy, now Turkey's going to become their number one enemy. If, of course, Iran's got nuclear weapons, so it's still a big enemy, but Turkey on their border could be a danger because Turkey is Islamist. If they build up this new guy, who knows? It could be a danger too. And that's going to help dissuade America from giving them arms and rebuilding their military.
But he was supported by Turkey as he came in, or at least
He is.
before he
And
came
Turkey wants to build his army.
in. Okay.
And in fact, a big news story today from Reuters is that one of the things he was doing in Istanbul is Turkey was pressuring him to have several bases around Syria and to sign a contract to build the army, have them trained in Turkey and trained by Turks. And Turkey would really like to be the dominant force.
Yeah. How much of that is anti-Kurd in the north of
Yeah,
Syria?
that's where I was going.
And how do the Kurds play into this?
Yeah.
Well, America owns 30% of the real estate in Syria. It owns it through its proxies, let me put it that way. And the Kurds are its major allied force because at first, America was building up the Arab Sunnis to take out Assad and to turn Syria into a pro-American country from being pro-Russia, pro-Iran. They wanted to flip it, be pro-American. So they thought they could get moderate Sunni Arab militias to take over. But once they realized that no, Al Qaeda and ISIS are the two dominant militias, they decided we got to kill these guys. This is a Frankenstein we don't want to deal with. And they went after ISIS. And in order to kill ISIS, they had to switch horses in the middle of the stream and go to the Kurds. Kurds are 10% of Syria. They're a different ethnic group. They speak a language related to Persian. It's an Indo-European language, let's put it that way. And many Kurds would like to have their own country, Kurdistan, which would include, 20% of Anatolia, Turkey, northern Iraq, hunk of Iran. And of course, this makes them enemies of everybody in the neighborhood because
Exactly.
nobody wants to lose 20% of their territory to some ethnic minority.
Yep.
So the Kurds get pounded on by everybody. But now they found a new champion in the United States who could exploit Kurdish nationalism in order to kill Arabs and to undo ISIS, which was an Arab Islamist force, a
Right.
Sunni Arab Islamist force. And the ISIS had been trying to drive the Kurds out of northern Syria. The Battle of Kobani was the big turning point, which was 200,000 Kurds being driven out, destroyed, and driven out into Turkey. America joined them, armed them, and then took them all away to kill ISIS. And that's how the Kurds ended up conquering 30% of Syria, which is north of the Euphrates River. So America took everything north of the Euphrates River and has a no-fly zone
Right.
and a number of bases, and it feeds the Kurds and keeps them, helps defend them. Turkey and the government in Damascus are both horrified by this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Turkey, in particular,
Mm-hmm.
is worried because about 20% of Turks are Kurds.
Kurds.
And there is an insurgency led by the PKK, the Turkish Workers' Party, that is considered a terrorist group by Turkey and by the United States because they've been fighting for, autonomy / independence for 40 years. And so Turkey says, America, you have sided with something that's worse than ISIS. You've sided with these Kurds. All the arms you give them, all the know-how, all the fighting prowess is going to seep across that border and it's going to turn into killing Turks. You've got to get out of there. You've got to stop this. You're supporting terrorists. And Turkey has been building up Arab militias that it's been defending in order to go kill those YPG, this Kurdish party.
Right.
And so
well, that's a good segue because the Trump administration announced we're getting out of Syria. So how will that affect things on the ground? Because the U.S. could pull out, but the Kurds in Syria now are fairly well armed and trained. If the U.S. withdraws, as we say we're going to, how do you see that spinning out?
Well, there are about 90,000 armed Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, which are led by Kurds. There are plenty of Arabs in there as well, and Christians and others, but it's led by Kurds. That's bigger than a force in Damascus today. Now, Damascus is building up its forces and recruiting every day, so it's going to the table will turn in the not too distant future. But Turkey is really pressing Damascus to go to war against these Kurds.
Mm.
And Al-Jolani, Shara, I should say, President Shara has said, I don't want to go to war against the Kurds.
Right.
I want to solve this on the diplomatic table. And I'm sure that that's caused a certain amount of friction between him and Erdogan.
Yeah.
And we saw when he went to visit Turkey just 2 days ago, there was some frostiness. And Erdogan walked into the room well ahead of him and left him following from behind instead of, going arm in arm into the and people were commenting on this. But obviously they have two very different national interests. Turkey wants action today, and Shara wants to bring the country together without causing a lot of bloodshed and tears.
Well, and also he and the Kurds were fighting on the same side, right? Like they might not have been together, but they were fighting against a common enemy for a long time. So
well, that's true. But many of the Arab opposition people said that the Kurds were agents of Assad. And that's because when Assad pulled out of eastern Syria, when the uprising started in 2011, and it became much bigger than he thought, he realized, I've got to dump eastern Syria, which is mostly desert, concentrate on the cities, which are in the west, Aleppo and so forth. So he pulled all his troops out. And when he did, he sort of handed the region over to the Kurds.
Oh.
Because he knew that the Kurds would be inimical to the Sunni Arab competitors.
Right.
And that as a minority, they would be more likely to be favorable to him. So many of the Arabs saw, those Kurds, you double-dealing douchebags, this kind of thing, and they didn't like it.
Okay.
Now, the Kurds, of course, were not fighting for Assad. They were fighting
No.
on their own ticket.
Right.
So they
Yeah.
were anti-Assad. They kicked out Assad's troops as much as they could,
Yeah.
and but they were trying to build. So they were trying to run between the legs
Yeah.
of Assad and the Sunni opposition in order to further their own position.
Right.
So it's really a three-legged stool, and to try to stick that leg on one side or the other, it depends on whose eyes you're looking through.
Yeah.
But the Kurds have been left over, and today the Syrian opposition groups that helped take Damascus are looking at the Kurds more and more as traitors who are trying to divide the country and are loyal to America and not to Damascus.
Interesting.
Now, the Kurds have switched their flag from the double-starred Syrian flag to the triple-starred Syrian flag, which is the revolutionary flag. But they've said, we're not going to give up our arms to Damascus until we know what kind of government this really is.
Yeah.
And
Smart.
yes, and they've said, we want half of the oil revenue. Most of Syria's oil is in that Kurdish zone.
Right.
And American troops are around those wells, protecting them. So that the money from the oil goes to the Kurds to help defray the costs of this. So it doesn't cost America very much.
Yeah. So I
But
know it's
Damascus wants those oil wells.
Oh yeah.
And it's good agricultural land. It's got the Euphrates River. All of this stuff, Damascus wants it back.
Yeah.
But the Kurds are asking they want their own, really, Ministry of Defense. They want their 90,000 Kurdish men kept under Kurdish generals and kept in their northeast over them. More or less like what the Kurdish region of Iraq has with their Peshmerga.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that protects them from Syria and from Turkey, potentially.
Correct.
If they keep them all up.
And, Damascus is saying, no way, we're not going to do this because it's a slippery slope towards independence.
Yeah.
And we're not going to do it. And we're going to ask the Americans to leave. And Turkey's pushing on the Americans to leave. And as soon as the Americans leave, the Kurds will be sitting ducks.
Yep.
Because they don't have an air force and they'll run out of money. So
you talked a minute ago about the Kurds not knowing what kind of government there is. Do you have any guesses?
Yeah.
Does the world have any guesses about where this is going? It's still pretty early, and it sounds like there's a lot of.
It's early, and
right.
What we're seeing in the Alawite regions is the Alawites are getting organized, and they're very fearful because there were many militias that were not subordinate to HTS and to Shara, who went to Damascus with him, but were funded and armed by the Turks, but were part of this, 1,000 different militias that had congealed into about 20, 25 important militias that were up in the north being protected by Turkey as well. And they went along with Ahmed Shara, but they haven't given up their arms. Now, they've all said that they would give up their first thing Shara did when he took Damascus was saying, all arms have to belong to.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a monopoly over the coercive power and all that sort of stuff. And these militias all said, yes, sir. But they haven't given up their arms. They still have their own commanders, and they're doing pretty much what they want. And they're going through the countryside, and there's a lot of irregularities. They're taking revenge on a lot of Alawites who, of course, were with the old regime and had tortured people, have blood on their hands. But they're not asking too many questions. So the Alawites don't know who do they consider to be guilty and who are they going to put a bullet through.
Right.
So there are many Alawites still hiding in their houses and are worried that there's going to be rough justice. There's also just been a lot of crime. People are very poor in Syria. You can't imagine how poor after 14 years of civil war and sanctions that are crushing. So everybody's hungry. There's a lot of crime. Houses are getting stolen. Apartments are getting stolen. Alawites are getting kicked out of their apartments, and these militia leaders are taking them and putting their people in them. There have been some bad little massacres on like 10 people killed in a village. They go into the village, people protest, they shoot them.
Right.
Hog tie them, beat them up, this kind of thing. So it hasn't been on a massive scale. It's not like France, 1944, when the Vichy government fell, and 10,000 French people were killed in rough justice in about a 6-month period. But it's been a lot less than that. but there's still enough that it makes people frightened. That
Yeah.
Ahmed Shadow's all his kind, honeyed words are just a smokescreen for something that's going to be much more discriminatory.
Right.
And
So
even if
that
he meant it, it sounds like he doesn't really have
was
enough
complete.
authority or control to stop other militias from carrying out revenge justice, right?
That's
There
what's
isn't
happening.
really central authority, right?
He only had about 30, maybe 40, depends on your estimates, men, 40,000 men underneath him when he took Damascus. So
Yeah,
the guy is trying to run a country almost the size of France
yeah,
with nothing. And
yeah,
he's trying to upscale really rapidly.
Right.
But it means that he's got to leave this in the hands of his lieutenants, many of whom are dyed in the wool Islamists. And, you know, there's a new police force being created. Everything's being created from the ground up.
Right.
None of these
Yeah.
all the institutions of the state have more or less collapsed. And we had a graduation ceremony just the other day that was on video. And all these new cadets are sitting there looking at their commandant who's saying, there's sort of a call and response. And he says, "What is our Constitution? What is our Constitution?" And they respond to him, the Quran, which Shut up has said that's not going to happen. There's going to be a committee. We're going to have a constitution. We're going to have elections. But they're saying the Quran. Then he says, the commandant says, "What is our path? Sabilina, sabilina, what is our path?" And the response is el jihad. Jihad is our path, in the way of Islam. And it's like, this went viral. And all the minorities, the Christians and the Druze and so forth, just looked
Freak
at
out.
this and they trembled in their boots. They
Oh
thought,
yeah.
oh man, here we go. Al Qaeda all the way. And now the president is saying, no, it's not true. And this is but it's, he doesn't have control over everything that's going on.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
how are things going for the average person? And we hear stories of a lot of refugees coming back. Syria has an enormous number of refugees outside the
Like
country
3 million
now.
or something, right?
Yeah. What are we
There are
looking at?
6 million outside of the country that were registered at one point. And
Okay.
many people have flown back. Many of my friends, Sunni Arab friends, and others who opposed Assad were forced to flee the country. As soon as Shara took power, they bought tickets. I'm going back to Syria. I
Interesting.
want to go to my apartment. I want to see my father. I want
Yeah.
to go
Yeah.
hug my brother. I just want to kiss the earth.
Mhm.
This is a day of freedom and celebration. And there was a wave of people who've gone back. And there's also many who are looking for jobs and thinking,
Yeah.
if this Shara is serious, he's got to build all these institutions. I'm qualified. I've been
That's right.
working for an international bank. I want a job. I want to build my country. So there's been a ton of interest, and Shara has been meeting with tons of exilees who've gone back. The trouble is, there are about 2 hours of electricity a day, 2 to 3.
Yeah.
There's no electricity because there's no petroleum,
Yeah.
there's no energy, and there's no money.
Right.
Right? The country is in total bankruptcy, and America has crushing sanctions. America has sanctioned the central bank. It sanctions just about everything in Syria. We lifted sanctions off of the head of al-Shara. We had a 10 million bounty on his head, and we took that off. But his party, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is still sanctioned. So it's unclear whether doing business with
Yeah.
any of his top lieutenants, you can't do it.
Right.
And any company, Saudi or Lebanese, that goes in and does business that breaks sanctions can be sanctioned by America because we also have indirect sanctions on it.
Mm.
So it gums up the work. We also own all of his 70% of his oil and gas.
Right.
Mhm.
So, and all those oil wells have been run into the ground. Syria is producing about 40,000 barrels of oil a day. It used to, pre-Civil War, produce 400,000
Wow.
barrels of oil a day. And that 400,000 barrels of oil a day funded 50% of government receipts in 2011.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that major income stream has disappeared.
Yeah. And we know from Iraq that it takes an enormous amount of time to get that back up and running, if it ever gets back up and running.
Well, you're absolutely right, because those wells have almost all been bombed because ISIS took them over and began to suck the oil out and fund its
Mhm.
caliphate. and America bombed them all and destroyed them. So it needs tons of work. It needs, billions of dollars of a big foreign firms to get in there and rejigger all these wells. And that can't happen as long as
Until
America
there's security.
separated the Kurdish hived off, and there's a question of whether America's going to leave or won't leave. And so until that's all settled, none of that can happen. So
It's really
Syria,
a chicken and egg, isn't it? Because
it
there's
is.
how are you going to get political stability until you can have some kind of economic activity? But who's going to go in and make that kind of investment without political stability? So, maybe Brian, this brings us to our last question,
Yes, I think you can
which
take
is how do you wave the magic wand and fix it all, Joshua?
Well, I wrote an article just recently for Foreign Affairs saying, America has to give this guy the benefit of the doubt because
Hmm.
he's the only leader Syria has. Because of his personal history, he's sort of the superhero. He's the George Washington or the Ataturk or whoever you want to call it of Syria today. Everybody knows his name. People are kissing his hand right and left. If you got rid of him, there would be nobody else to take.
right.
There would be a big fight between hundreds of militias, and Syria would go to even a darker place. So America really needs to take this guy at his word and say, we'll help you. And we're going to just lift sanctions. We won the war. We got rid of Assad. We got rid of Iran. We got rid of we're just going to help you rebuild. Now, of course, America's not going to do that.
Although that sounds right up Trump's alley. Victory, build. Like those are the two things he says. I won. Let's build.
Well, but a lot of his lieutenants, Trump's lieutenants, are old neoconservatives.
Yup.
They're also very attached to Israel.
Yup.
Also, many of them are attached to the Kurds. They don't want to let the Kurds down who helped us. So, and there's many congressmen also who are pushing forward bills that we've got to stay with the Kurds. So there's tons of lobbying going on in Washington, and it's going in every direction. And Trump did say, I want to get out of Syria, but then he took it back and said, well, not so fast. And our people are looking at it. So we've had Secretary of State says we should stay. Many other top people have said we should stay. So, or that we should take a step-by-step approach to Jolani. If he does good things, we will begin to diminish the sanctions because the sanctions are what we have as leverage. And nobody wants to give up leverage. Once you've got the leverage, who wants to give it up? It's a drug. So you can't say I won and get the hell out of there.
Right.
You got to stay in there and micromanage Syria. The trouble is it's strangling the country, and we're going to cause this guy to fail. I don't know if we are, but chances are we will, just because things go wrong in the Middle East very easily, and this guy's got nothing. And more people will turn against him if he can't feed. People are hungry in Syria. He needs to turn on the spigot. And that's why he's going to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all of his neighbors.
Right.
And he's
anyone who can help, right?
Yeah. Anybody who can help. And they are helping. Qatar has helped him raise salaries for everybody, 400%. He raised the first thing he did because Qatar gave him almost $1 billion. You do that for a year. We're going to jumpstart this economy.
Yeah.
The trouble is, without total security and without lifting sanctions, it's going to be very hard to do that. So he's in this, as you said, he's in this tricky situation where he's got to reassure the West and build up an army. But that's why I think, he's going to have to keep Russia on the back burner because they're the only country that can balance Turkey. China, you would think he would turn to China, which he would like to do. But China, a lot of the foreign fighters who fought with him for the last decade are Uyghurs from Western China. And he's put a lot of them into top military positions, and he's nationalized, given them Syrian nationality and put them in as generals. And China was apoplectic.
Oh, yeah.
You can't do that.
Yeah.
Because these guys are going to get, they're going to do stuff and they're going to come back and blow us up.
Yeah.
So China's unlikely to support them. America's unlikely to support them militarily. that leaves him with Turkey and Russia. And I think, Russia wants those bases back. It wants a lot of things, and it's willing to do a lot to get them. It won't happen tomorrow because Assad is being in Russia. And the first thing he said is, I want Assad back for this, and I want the billions that he took and are in Russian banks back. So there are lots of stumbling blocks, but there are reasons why he might go to Russia and try to rebuild his military. So he's in a real pickle, trying to please everybody, and he's going to have a hard time doing it, bringing stability to his country, winning over the love of the international community, and restarting his economy.
So
and it's not like Russia's in a position to help so much for a while. Anyway, he could, if you're looking for Russia to save you, Russia's looking for others to help them. Joshua, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. And as events warrant, we hope we can have you back to clarify what I'm sure will be confusing futures in Syria for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you both, Brian, Joel. Great questions and a wonderful platform.
Excellent. You have almost clarified, except you've made it worse.
Yes. Which, welcome to the World Discord podcast. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please like and share. Tell your friends, tell your enemies. David, thanks for producing, and we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you all.